Hello, I'm Shafitri, and in the next few minutes, we will talk about the General Agreement on Trade in Services and the technical barriers to trade. Alright, let's get started. The General Agreement on Trade in Services is a relatively new agreement which represents the first time that services have been brought into a multilateral trade agreement. The GATS came into force in January 1995 as a result of the Uruguay Round. All member states of the World Trade Organization are signatories to the GATS and have to assume the resulting obligations. As stated in its preamble, the GATS has two main pillars that contribute to world services trade. The first is to ensure transparency and predictability of relevant rules and regulations. Second, to promote progressive liberalization through successive rounds of negotiations. The definitions of services trade under the GATS is four-pronged, which depends on the territorial presence of the supplier and the consumer at the time of the transaction. The first mode is cross-border trade, a mode of supply that doesn't require the physical movement of producers or consumers. Second, consumption abroad or movement of consumers, which involves the consumer traveling to the country of the producers and is typical of the consumption of tourism services. Third, commercial presence, which involves services that require a commercial presence by producers in the country of the consumers and is typical of financial services. And the last one is movement of natural persons, which involves a non-commercial presence by producers to supply consulting, construction, and instructional services. The scope and application of the GATS is in pursuant to Article 1.1 includes the purchase, payment or use of a service, the access to and use of in connection with the supply of a service, services which are required by those members to be offered to the public generally, and the presence, including commercial presence, of persons of a member for the supply of a service in the territory of another member. For purposes of structuring their commitments, WTO members have generally used a classification system comprised of 12 core service sectors, including business services, communication services, construction and related engineering services, distribution services, educational services, environmental services, financial services, health-related and social services, tourism and travel-related services, recreational, cultural and sporting services, transport services, and other services not included elsewhere. The most favored nation, or MFN, principle is the cornerstone of the multilateral trading system conceived after the Second World War, which seeks to replace the frictions and distortions of power-based or bilateral policies with the guarantees of a rule-based framework where trading rights do not depend on the individual participants' economic or political clout. In the context of the GATS, the MFN obligation is applicable to any measure that affects trade in services in any sector falling under the agreement, whether specific commitments have been made or not. The GATS is a very flexible agreement that allows each member to adjust the conditions of market entry and participation to its sectors, like specific objectives and constraints. Two sets of legal obligations, governing respectively, market access and national treatment, are relevant in this context. The market access provisions of GATS cover 6 types of restrictions that must not be maintained in the absence of limitations. It includes the number of services suppliers, the value of service transactions or assets, the number of operations or quantity of output, the number of natural persons supplying a service, the type of legal entity or joint venture, and the participation of foreign capital. Meanwhile, the national treatment implies the absence of all discriminatory measures that may modify the conditions of competition to the detriment of foreign services or service suppliers. The basic structure of the GATS consists of the text of the agreement, including a preamble, 29 articles arranged in 6 parts, and various annexes, and a schedule of commitments for each WTO member. The 29 articles are arranged in 6 parts as follows. The GATS makes a clear distinction between domestic regulation and measures subject to trade liberalization. It explicitly recognizes the continued right and possibly the need of members to enforce domestic policy objectives through regulation as well as promotes the objective of progressive liberalization. While there are public policies that don't require regulatory support, there are others that might require it, such as equitable access, consumer protection, job creation in disadvantaged regions, labor market integration of disadvantaged persons, reduction of environmental impacts and other externalities, macroeconomic stability, avoidance of market dominance and anti-competitive conduct, and avoidance of tax evasion, fraud, etc. The Council for Trade and Services has been given a particular negotiating mandate, which allows the Council to develop, in appropriate bodies, any necessary disciplines to prevent domestic regulations from constituting unnecessary barriers to trade. In addition, the Working Party on Domestic Regulation, or WPDR, has been reviewing principles that could form a framework for regulatory development, including necessity, transparency, equivalence, and international standards. So this is how the GATS is administered. The top decision-making body of the WTO is the Ministerial Conference, which is composed of representatives of all members and is represented by the General Council in the conference. The Council for Trade and Services operates under the guidance of the General Council and is responsible for overseeing the functioning of the GATS. The Council for Trade and Services also supervises the activities of committees and working parties under the Trade and Services. Dispute settlement provided by WTO offers a unique contribution to the peace and stability of the global economy. The appellate body of WTO supervises dispute settlements. This figure depicts the procedure of dispute settlement.
Next topic is role and responsibilities of member governments. The first point, ministries and agencies involved. The General Agreement on Trade in Services is a relatively new agreement. Then, they don't have a central structure for coordinating their services-related policies. Actually, regulation of services often happen at sub-federal levels, such as state, province. A related challenge is the fact that 160 services subsector involved, which would be difficult to oversee for any central agency. Next point, notification. In addition to their transparency obligation, members have further notification and information requirements in specified circumstances. They need to notify and provide information on establishment of inquiry points and contract point, progress on implementation, opening of negotiation, adoption or significant modification, and etc. Third point, potentially relevant principle. Inquiry points are intended only for government access. In order to be effective, they must have at their disposal an inventory or a database of relevant measures and international agreement. Okay, this is the last point for this topic, contact points. The goal is to facilitate access of developing countries' services supplier to inform regarding commercial and technical aspects to the supply of services like a registration, recognition, and obtaining of professional qualification and the availability of service technology. Next topic, the challenges ahead. First point, the Doha Development Agreement. Beyond its embracing the negotiating guidelines, this is at least two reasons. First, the success of the Doha Conference and its integration of services into a wider negotiating context to the resilience of the multilateral framework. And the second, the declaration provide for negotiation in areas beyond those addressed in the guidelines. Second point, negotiation on GATS rules. Emergency safeguards in services may be expected to allow for the temporary suspension of market access, national treatment, and any additional commitments that members may have assumed in individual sectors. Government procurement. The agreement applies to purchases of goods and services and provide for transparency and in specifically listed sector non-discrimination in the award process among signatories. And last, subsidiary. Like other measures affecting trade in services, subsidies are already subject to the GATS. Okay, next point, assessment of trade and services. The delegation has found it difficult to finish the assessment. This may be due not only to natural divergences in policy objective and negotiating interests, but also to problems of data availability and comparability across countries, sector, and modes. Okay, work program on e-commerce. As we know, information technology and telecommunication have resulted in a virtually borderless global economy, allowing any services that can be digitized and transmitted electronically to be produced and delivered anywhere in the world. The Internet provides a low-cost, highly efficient way to approach potential customers worldwide. The role of the WTO and GATS will be to ensure that the broad economic advantages of multilateral rules and obligations will accrue to electronic supplies just as they do to other forms of trade. Okay, next topic, preparing requests and offers. First, identifying trading partners, sector, and modes. Potentially interesting export destinations therefore include markets or countries where nationals move for post-secondary education and training, to which nationals have immigrated, with which close trade and investment links exist. Technical aspect of requests. There are possible relevant targets. First, addition of sectors that are not included in the relevant schedule. Second, removal of existing limitation or reduction, for example, like increases in the number of admitted suppliers or the level of foreign equity participation. And the third one is inscription of additional commitments relating to matters not falling within the scope. Okay. The third point is technical aspect of offers. Offers would normally address the same issue as listed above, for example, like addition of new sector, the removal of existing limitation, or the binding of modes not currently committed, and the undertaking of additional commitments. Offers will be submitted against the backdrop of existing schedule. This is the last topic, misconception about the GATS. First point, sources of criticism. Civil society representatives have repeatedly voiced concern about the public policy implication of the GATS. Such a concern devolved inter alia around the agreement's perceived impact on government's ability to regulate socially important services and ensure equitable access across region and population groups. It has been alleged that the concept of progressive liberalization combined with the commercialization of some public services in individual countries. Last point, complexity as a challenge. The GATT is structurally more complex than the GATT. This relatively complex structure of the agreement is intended to enable members to accommodate sector or mood-specific constraints they may encounter in the scheduling process and to progressively their services trade in line with their national policy objective and levels of developments.
Okay, so the next thing we will talk about is technical barriers to trade. The Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement came into force on January 1, 1995. The agreement aims to ensure that technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures are non-discriminatory and not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. The purpose of the TBT agreement is to avoid unnecessary obstacles to international trade and allows regulatory autonomy to protect legitimate interests. Subsequently, the TBT agreement covers trade in all goods, both agricultural and industrial. The TBT agreement distinguishes between three categories of measures: technical regulations that set out requirements with which compliance is mandatory, standards, which can be developed by a large number of different entities, and conformity assessment procedures, which are used to determine whether goods such as toys, electronics, food, and beverages fulfill the requirements established by relevant technical regulations or standards. The key principles of the TBT agreement are non-discrimination, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade, the use of international standards, as well as technical assistance and special and differential treatment for developing countries. In the context of the TBT agreement, transparency consists of three core elements: provisions on the notification of draft technical regulations, the establishment of inquiry points, and publication requirements for technical regulations. The transparency disciplines discussed previously are closely linked to the work of the TBT committee. The purpose of this committee is to serve as a platform to discuss concerns that may arise in the context of the exchanges of information required by the TBT agreement's transparency provisions. The work of the TBT committee involves two broad areas. First is the review of specific measures to discuss specific trade concerns such as specific laws, regulations, or procedures that affect the trade, and second, strengthening implementation in which members exchange experiences on the implementation of the agreement with a view to making implementation more effective and efficient. Alright, that's all from me and my partner. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.